Hello everyone, Garfum here, and today I want to talk about the Diablo 3 Developer Insights post and Diablo 3 seasonal themes. Alright, starting off with the Diablo 3 Developer Insights blog on balancing and class set design. So my initial reaction to this article was focusing on the quote that the ideal class set performance for Diablo 3 is approximately Greater Rift 130 solo and assumes the character has 5,000 Paragon levels. And 5,000 Paragon levels, and what I took away from it was 5,000 Paragon levels is common enough in non-season that it is used as a reference point for balance, and that's why I don't play the game anymore. So that is my initial reaction to the blog post. There's some other interesting good points that they do mention later on that I'll get to, but let's focus on Paragon for a moment, and I'll give a as quick of an explanation as possible for the Paragon Problem for those that don't know what it is somehow, even though almost every single content creator for Diablo 3 has talked about it at some point, and that's why most prominent Diablo 3 streamers have quit, and other top players. So what is the problem with Paragon? It's essentially an unlimited source of more power for your character, and it's a significant source of power that can make a difference of several Greater Rift levels when comparing characters between 1 to 2,000 Paragon to someone of 5,000 Paragon. So if you're 2,000 Paragon with the same gear as someone with 5,000 Paragon, the person with 5,000 Paragon is going to do several tiers higher by default, basically, if you both have the same skill level and same gear. Paragon can end up being the only difference between two completed perfect characters, as all other sources of power, being gear and gem levels, have a limit in theory that can be met to have a perfect character. Now, keeping both these things in mind, when a player wants to compete on the leaderboards to give themselves the best chance of being able to place higher on the leaderboards, they're going to want to gain as much Paragon as possible. More Paragon, more damage, get higher on the leaderboards, or more survivability as well. So now players that are serious about pushing the leaderboards need to decide if they want to commit to grinding Paragon for an entire 3 to 6 month long season. And a side note that I believe the game should be balanced around seasons, and I'll get to that later. People who don't want to commit to 3 to 6 months of grinding Paragon will likely not play this season at all. That's when or only for a few days and stop, and that's usually what I do. I will actually not be playing the next season though, because it's the same day as the Path of Exile League. Anyways, and remember, we're talking about players that want to push the leaderboards, not casual players, since we're referencing balanced decisions being made around Greater Rift 130. That's going to be for those players that are pushing leaderboards. So players that do commit are essentially now trapped into spending as much of their free time as possible farming Paragon, and usually what will happen is players will feel guilty for playing other games or doing other hobbies in their free time. And grinding this much Paragon for 3 to 6 months also easily leads to burnout, and players just give up midway through the season or burn out from the game entirely, which a lot of people have burned out from the game entirely. So that is the main issue with Paragon, and the only real solution would be to cap Paragon or rework the system entirely, and which it's been made pretty clear that neither of those things will happen. Although if Blizzard intends to maintain and keep creating content for Diablo 3, which they're still making new content, new sets right now, it would probably be in their best interest to fix this problem for the health of the game long term, but I digress. They're not doing anything with Paragon, so The next best way to address the Paragon problem would be to balance end game content around seasonal play and balance it so that it requires less Paragon to reach the maximum Greater Rift, which they said in this post they won't be raising the Greater Rift beyond 150, which is a very good decision. It may have taken a long time to get there, but it is definitely the step in the right direction. So there's two main things I would change from how they're currently choosing to balance sets. I would balance around seasonal play and require less Paragon so more people can achieve Greater Rift 150. So, and how do I know that they're not balancing around seasonal play right now? They mention that 5,000 Paragon should be a good middle number, but when you're looking at seasonal play, that is nowhere close to being a middle number. That is like a handful of 20 to 50 people even getting close to that number. I think maybe 10 or 20 have hit 5,000 in a season, in this season. Yeah, so it's obviously being balanced around non-seasonal then if they're referencing 5,000 Paragon as a middle point. So, why do we want to balance around seasonal gameplay? That's where the majority of the players are, and that's where the real competition is. But what about non-seasonal players? Yes, there are obviously some non-seasonal players, but given infinite Paragon scaling and legacy items, no one really competes there. On the non-seasonal leaderboards, it's mostly testing grounds for new content, and yeah, with Paragon just keeps going up, nobody would want to compete there seriously. It's mostly just for funsies, whatever. I think the game should be balanced around seasonal play because that's when most of your players come into the game, is during a fresh season start, and that's sort of the point of a fresh season start, is everybody starts at the same time on a new character, on a new account, essentially. So, now why do we want more people being able to clear GR 150? Two reasons. Since there will be a hard cap on GR 150, if more people are able to clear it, this lessens the impact of Paragon, helping ease the Paragon problem. After clearing 150 is achievable on your character, the only further help more Paragon would provide is being able to do a 150 faster, which, in my opinion, is a better balance of power provided by Paragon, as opposed to the current situation where having 1,000 or 2,000 more Paragons on a similarly geared character and a similarly skilled player will result in clearing several tiers higher. It helps curb our Paragon problem if more people can reach the GR cap of 150 within having a reasonable amount of Paragon. Second, we want there to be a large and definite and definitive end goal for players to strive towards to keep people playing. Currently, I can see 3 driving forces in-game that keeps players interested, engaged in playing the game, and they all do their job pretty poorly right now. There's a seasonal journey which sets goals and rewards players for some of those goals, with cosmetics and the Hadrig's Gift. And then there's leaderboards, and there's the positive feedback loop of loot drops. So those are the 3 things: the leaderboards, seasonal journey, and the feedback loop of loot drops. Those are what keep people playing, that are designed and built into the game. Another thing that some players do to keep themselves playing is to set their own goals, but that is not a part of the game, so we're not including self-made goals. We're talking about stuff that Blizzard has implemented and designed in their games. So leaderboards, seasonal journey, and feedback loop from loot drops. Okay, seasonal journey, for the most part, feels like a boring checklist of chores to be done to get some not very great rewards. The Hadrig's Gift is basically, if you're trying to go fast and progress to the end game as fast as possible, it's required, and the stuff to do it, very easy and simple, and it's just do this, boring stuff, get it out of the way, you get your set for free. And then the cosmetic stuff I haven't gone for in a while, but I believe it's just stuff you would do, mostly stuff you would do naturally. It's kind of easy, except for maybe set dungeons. You have to go out of your way to do those. But yeah, I've never really liked the set dungeons very much either, so again, it's just going out of your way to do more boring tasks to get some cosmetics. So the seasonal journey is essentially a boring checklist for some for a guaranteed set, and then some pretty meh cosmetic rewards. And then, as explained in the Paragon Problem, the leaderboards require too much commitment for too little reward and easily causes player burnout. That's why leaderboards aren't very good at keeping players playing right now. And then there's the positive feedback loop from loot dropping, and a quick rundown of what I mean by that for people that don't know. Positive feedback loop is something that happens that causes the same thing to happen again and again, and becomes stronger with each iteration. In this case, the positive feedback loop we're talking about is finding new items, which makes your characters more powerful, and the result, you can find more items more quickly and continue to make your character stronger, faster. The problem with the Diablo 3's positive feedback loop is it doesn't last long enough at all and quickly deteriorates from getting cool new fun items that enhance your build to getting better versions of your current items, which is slightly less fun, and then finally you're just at the very end being rewarded with more Paragon, which is not very fun at all. The three phases, I'll call them, of the positive feedback loop. And for veteran players, the first phase of this feedback loop is over within hours of a new season. The second phase most meaningful upgrades to current gear can be found in a week or two, and then it's more minor upgrades throughout the rest of the season and grinding Paragon, which is the third part. So with the current systems in place that keep people playing being very poor, adding a tangible, definitive long-term goal such as clearing the highest possible Greater Rift, I think is something many veteran players would strive for if it could be done within 1 or 2 months. Personally, I would like to see it 150 achievable within 2 to 3 weeks, because that's probably the amount of time I'd be willing to commit to a Diablo 3 season. But I could see this for balancing the game overall. It taking 1 or 2 months could be a more better middle ground. And if you balance it too easily, where GR 150 is completed too quickly, then it ends up with the same problem of the loot drop feedback loop ending early. You get to the last stage of the game, or like the very final thing to do, way too early. So 1 to 2 months seems more reasonable. So if this is something that could be achieved within 1 or 2 months by some of the best players, then I'm confident more people would play longer to try and achieve it. The reason for keeping something within 1 or 2 months is to avoid the same burnout problem caused by the current leaderboard grind. And then if it takes any longer than 2 months, it's no longer something that's a tangible goal within a season. It's something that maybe you could reach by the end of the season, and that's currently the same problem that the leaderboard already has, is you grind the entire season just to push at the end. Or you grind Paragon the entire season and push at the very end. Now, if GR 150 was reachable for at least, let's say, 100 players per class within 1 to 2 months, there would be a definitive big endgame goal for players to reach towards. Since we're capped at 150, it lessens the impact of Paragon once players reach GR 150 cap, but there is still room for those players that like the current Paragon grind and leaderboard grind to be able to compete for faster GR 150s. If we're balancing around seasonal gameplay, then the 5,000 Paragon number given for balancing is obviously way too high, as I stated earlier. They state that they want to hit a middle ground, so it is obvious that it's being balanced around non-seasonal gameplay I mentioned earlier. Because only a handful of people are getting 5,000, and there's barely anybody else even getting close to 5,000. So I think there's two different, better approaches to balancing here. We could follow the template Blizzard is currently using, but let's say change it so that the sets are balanced around GR130 and having 2,000 or 3,000 Paragon, something that is still, in my opinion, very hard to obtain within a season, but it is much more obtainable. And given the fact that Blizzard said in the post that they don't want to balance classes around seasonal themes, and I think the game should be balanced around seasonal play at sort of a baseline, this is probably realistically the better of the two options I've come up with. So balance around sets being expected to clear GR 130 with 3,000 Paragon, let's say. I'd prefer 2,000. Let's go closer to their goal and say 3,000. So balance around sets being expected to clear 130 with 3,000 Paragon without the seasonal theme. And this way, even if the seasonal theme provides little to no power, we have this as a baseline, and any extra power, in my opinion, is better because it would help trend towards more people getting GR150. So the other option is balancing around the Greater Rift cap itself, which would probably be impossible to get right, but would feel really good if they could somehow balance this way. So how would we balance around the Greater Rift cap? We would look at the leaderboards and decide approximately how many players do we want to see completing Greater Rift 150. So let's say we want 500 players per class to complete a GR 150 on softcore, and we balance around reaching that number. However, I said this is nearly impossible, and it's not going to be feasible because seasonal theme is going to affect that greatly. Class popularity per season and number of players per season is going to change this number. If there's less people in a season, then the sets are there's not going to be 500 players reaching that number if they balanced around a number, or if there's a lot more players, then there's going to be more players completing 150. So it's kind of it's a hard number to balance around if those three things are fluctuating so much. But if they could match this system or get this system to work, it would closely match other competitive systems in other games where certain percentage of players are expected to complete the hardest content, or it's a little bit of a stretch, but similar to certain percentages of players being within certain ELO brackets in competitive games. But again, that's a bit of a stretch. I think it'd be interesting if they could balance that way, but I don't think they can. So now if we look at their comments about trying to back away from the GR 150 cap, they pretty much have the opposite idea of what I do. But it seems kind of contradictory to put in a Greater Rift cap and then back away from it so that players can't reach it. It may as well still be infinite, but the one positive thing for them that this would do if they have a cap, but they want to back away from it, the one advantage this provides is that if they have sets performing where they want them to be, then it's easier to bring the outliers closer to the sets that are balanced than it is to buff everything up to the highest performing set, which is what we saw them doing for years. They just kept buffing everything, and then you saw like 100 million trillion crit or something I saw in a video yesterday. It was pretty great. And so that's how you end up with some number I don't even know how to actually read. So basically, it's a lot easier to bring everything in together than it is to match everything with the highest outlier. So say most builds are here in the center, and then you have one outlier here and one outlier here, and this is a higher performing one. So it's easier to bring both these closer to everything else than it is to bring everything to this outlier, because what ends up happening and what had been happening is like 1 or 2 builds way overshoots that mark, but they don't want to nerf them. So then they keep trying to bring everything up and bring everything up, and there's always 1 or 2 builds that go past it, and they keep scaling up and up and up forever. So with having a cap and then trying to back away from it, you can pick a point where you want everything to end up, and it's much easier to balance that way. I will give them that point, but that's makes it easier for balancing. I don't think it exactly makes the game more fun. Overall, I think some good decisions are being made about keeping the GR 150 cap, and that they're more willing to experiment with seasonal themes that could have a bigger impact, and they aren't worried about seasonal buffs potentially allowing certain builds to overperform in certain seasons. Because to me, the closer we get to the cap, the better, so I'd like to see certain builds be able to overperform with seasonal themes, with the current way they're trying to balance. However, unless they put in like actually fun, impactful seasonal themes, which the upcoming one I don't think is going to be fun and not hugely game changing. You get 2 extra item slots essentially, which you've gotten an extra ring slot in a previous season and 2 extra ring slots if you were playing Legacy of Nightmares in another season. So this isn't exactly a huge difference from those. So if they can't come up with better seasonal themes, I don't think the way they're currently balancing will help the health of the game, as Paragon is inherently broken, and Paragon would need to be fixed, or they need to balance around a Paragon level that is more obtainable in seasonal gameplay. Otherwise, a GR150 cap means nothing if no one can reach it anyways, and they might achieve the balance they want, but it will not actually feel any different for the players, because they will still be playing the same way they have been playing to compete on the leaderboards, which is grinding Paragon for 3 to 6 months. So at the end of the day, they might achieve balance, but it doesn't change the unfun gameplay. So, since I'm constantly bashing Blizzard for their really bad seasonal themes, for the longest time I was saying, they should do something more with seasons, and they started doing something with seasons. They introduced seasonal themes, and then they're really, really crappy and have almost no impact on the game. Constantly bash them for that. Oh, well, I bet you can't do better. Well, I'm gonna try and do that right now. The next topic, pretty closely related to what we just talked about. Specifically, I want to reference this tweet responding to Brandy Camel's post, asking what you would like to see most out of a seasonal buff or a seasonal theme. So let's dive pretty deep into this and go over, in general, how seasonal themes should be designed, and I'll give 2 examples that fit these designs that I think could realistically be done, given the smaller patches Diablo 3's been receiving. Okay, first of all, I'm going to heavily compare this to Path of Exile leagues, because I believe Path of Exile leagues are being made, for the most part, in a fun way. But before you dismiss the thought of comparing these 2 games, I am aware that GGG has a lot more resources to invest into creating leagues than Blizzard has investing into creating seasonal themes. The main point of comparing or looking at Path of Exile's leagues is to pick out the general concepts that make a good league, so we can help make a good Diablo 3 seasonal theme. So let's list out all the seasonal themes and all the leagues. Now I'm going to be focusing on the Path of Exile leagues that I've played extensively myself, or ones that have been added to the base game and that I've heard from other players about their original implementation. So this will be Harbinger League and everything released after it, plus Breach and Pirandus League. All the other leagues, I don't know too much about their original implementation, so I'll be ignoring them. And here is how I think the community reacted to most of these leagues based on my own experiences and from reading and watching other players' experiences. So there's always going to be a wide range of responses to every league, and I'm trying my best to reflect the majority of players out of the leagues that I've played and listed. The one that stands out to me as being mostly received negative is going to be Synthesis. Then some of the mixed reviewed leagues are Parandus, Harbinger, Bestiary, Betrayal, and Blight. And finally, the leagues that were received as mostly positive: Breach, Abyss, Incursion, Delve, Legion, and Metamorph. So what makes a good league or season? Here are the important elements that I've pulled out of the Path of Exile leagues. So a league or season should introduce a new mechanic that incorporates player agency, a burst of increased fighting or increased combat intensity, and impactful and meaningful rewards. Those three things are sort of the most important factors, I think, in creating a fun league or a fun season. So let's sort of define or explain what I mean by each of these. They're kind of self-explanatory, but player agency or player choice should offer players the ability to make meaningful choices that impact their gameplay. At the most simple level, it can be players deciding whether to interact with the mechanic or ignore it. However, it's better implemented when choosing how difficult the encounter of the mechanic is outside of base difficulties. So we're not talking about changing the torment difficulty or the map tier or map mods. The player should be able to choose how difficult that encounter is on a case-by-case basis depending on their surroundings or their builds. Examples of this are Legion and Metamorph. In Legion, you open up a shrine, and then a bunch of basically statues of monsters spawn, and you get to go and break those statues to decide which ones are going to spawn into actual monsters. That is an example of players being able to choose the difficulty of the encounter. They can go and break open all the monsters and not give a shit, and then they spawn everything, and that will include a lot of difficult monsters. Or a player could go pick more carefully the very rewarding monsters or the monsters they know they can handle that won't get them killed. Same kind of concept applied to Metamorph. Metamorph League, you gathered organs. You combine those organs to create a boss, and depending on the stats or rewards on the organs determined how difficult the boss would be. So you could kind of craft your own boss. You could put in all the really good rewarding organs, and that usually ends up creating a very difficult boss. Or you could put in some of the easier organs with one or two of the things you really want. Again, that's a lot of ways that the player can choose how difficult that mechanic is going to be for them without changing baseline difficulties. And another way that player agency can be incorporated is players choosing their rewards. And again, the same examples are Legion and Metamorph, and Incursion, which I didn't talk about already. So, like with Legion, when you pop it open and you see all the statues of the monsters, it has what type of reward. Certain monsters will drop a guaranteed reward, and it will show you a symbol above that monster which reward. So you can go and pick out the rewards you want. Same with Metamorph. When you put the organs in, it told you what type of reward you would get from the boss after killing it if you put that organ in. Incursion, you get to pick between, you build up a temple that has rooms, and different rooms have different rewards and different monsters, etc. So you got to choose how to build your temple between 2 different rooms at a time, unlocking doors in that temple. Betrayal was also another example where you could kind of choose how difficult the encounters would be and your rewards. Basically, there were a couple different types of encounters that would have unique, like 1 to 3 unique monsters, I'll call them. They're betrayal, mastermind people, whatever. But there'd be 1 to 3 of them per encounter. That would be sort of the difficult thing you need to kill in that encounter. So you could choose whether or not to upgrade them or downgrade them. If you upgraded them, they became harder to kill. They would get more special abilities. Or you could downgrade them, and their rewards would be lesser, but they would have less special abilities to kill you with. And then you could also choose where they, what sort of encounters they moved to influence the rewards. It's a little bit complicated to try and explain quickly, but that was also a league where you could somewhat choose the difficulty of the encounters, and you could definitely choose what kind of rewards you wanted. So those are examples of player agency, or player choice, however you want to call it. Next, bursts of increased fighting or increased combat intensity usually takes the form of very quickly spawning lots of mobs in a small area, or spawning or coming across very few very difficult boss-like monsters. Whatever this encounter may be, there should be at least 1 per map or rift, but depending on the type of mechanic, there could be a couple per map or rift. But there shouldn't be too many in a single map or single rift, because then the encounter sort of becomes less meaningful, and the map or area could become too bloated and very difficult to complete or impossible to complete, and you don't want it to be too much. And then impactful and meaningful rewards, pretty self-describing, but the important thing is that these rewards should be sought after and make doing the league or seasonal mechanic worth it for the player. So whatever the reward is, it needs to be at least on par with other sources that give the same or similar reward, or slightly better than those other sources. Now, what I think was the really fun part is rating each league and season based on these 3 criteria. There's obviously other things that go into a good Path of Exile league, and other things that the Diablo Season 3 themes lack entirely, but I think these are the 3 important ones again. So let's go through each of them one by one. I'll rate a league or season's player agency, a burst of combat, and its rewards for each league or season on a 0 to 2 scale. So 0 is it's not implemented at all or barely. 1 is it's kind of implemented, and 2 it's implemented fully, very well done, something like that. So first, Parandus League. Player agency, I gave it a 1. I'm being kind of lenient just so that all the Diablo 3 seasonal themes don't end up at all 0s. So the player agency here was Parandus League, there was a chest you'd open, it'd spawn monsters, you'd get coins, and then you can spend those coins at Parandus, and here you're basically able to choose what you want to spend the coins on or sell them to other players. So it gets a 1 for choice, player agency. Combat Burst, it gets a 1 because those chests did spawn monsters. It doesn't spawn a whole lot of them, so it's not going to get a 2 because it's kind of lacking in that regard. And Reward gets a 1 because you could spend those coins to get some pretty impressive rewards. but it was very high variance, so you could be getting nothing good for a very long time from Parandis chests or from Kadiro. So Parandis League gets a 3. Breach, player agency. There wasn't a whole lot of choice. It was either you choose to do it or you choose not to do it, so give it a 1. Combat Burst gets a 2. It spawned, at the time it was first implemented, this was very popular because it spawned a lot of mobs in an expanding circle. And it still does spawn a lot of mobs. Compared to some of the newer leagues, it's not as impressive, but it was still very impressive at the time, and it's still rather impressive now. And also the end game mechanic for Breach does spawn a lot of mobs as well. So good combo burst. I keep saying combo burst. Good combat burst. And the reward is kind of meh. You get splinters to go into endgame boss area, and they could have some good rewards, but it's other leagues have done better, so we give it a 1. Breach gets a 4. Harbinger League, player agency, you basically choose not to do it or skip it, and then you can use the currency that you get or sell it. That's basically the choices there. Combat Burst, similar to Barandis, these Harbingers spawned some minions, but it wasn't a whole lot, and they aren't that difficult to deal with. And the end game breach heads, I haven't done a whole lot of, but I don't think they're that intense if I remember correctly. And rewards, I gave a 0. There was a lot of backlash. Well, not really backlash. There was a lot of criticism around the rewards because it dropped currency splinters, which just ended up being like smaller versions of normal currency for the most part, which didn't feel that great. So it gets a 0 for rewards. Harbinger overall gets a 2. Abyss League, player agency, once again, you choose to do it or skip it, and choose to kill the boss if it spawned or skip it. Not a whole lot of choice. Combat Burst, give it a 2. It did spawn lots of monsters, and it did spawn some very difficult monsters from the per map instances, and then it had some kind of decent boss fights. And the rewards, I'd give it 2 because the jewels are kind of fun, and the uniques on release, some of the uniques were very powerful, especially the helmet, and I believe there's still some good Abyss uniques, so we give that a 2. Bestiary, player agency, I gave a 2. So in this league, you collected monsters in nets. These were very difficult, or more difficult to kill monsters than normal mobs. They were actually, certain ones were more difficult to kill than bosses. So you could I believe you could target farm certain beasts. I wasn't a big fan of this league, so I'm not too informed on it, but you could go and try to farm specific beasts and then use them for different kinds of crafting recipes. So there was a good bit of choice. Combat Burst, I gave a 1 because the mobs mostly were just way overtuned and I hated it, but there was definitely increased fighting. That's for sure, even if a lot of it resulted in one-shots. And then the reward, I gave a 0. There were some good bestiary recipes, but I think overall it's somewhat underwhelming. Maybe it's biased that I didn't like the league. I give it a 0, but I don't think it's that highly sought after. Very niche cases, I think people will go for it, but I don't think that's enough to give it more than 0. So bestiary overall a 3. Incursion, gets 2s across the board. Player agency, so Incursion was the league where you could build temples that had different rooms and different rewards in the temples. Each incursion you went into, you got to choose whether to change the room or upgrade the room, so there was a lot of choices in how to build your temple, and you also had to choose which doors to open. You could usually get all the doors open, but I'd say overall there was a lot of player choice. Combat burst. These rooms were chock full of mobs, and some of them were very dangerous. They were fun instances to go into and kill a bunch of mobs. And the rewards, I gave it 2 because temple, if you upgraded the right temple rooms, you could get very good rewards. So gets 2s all across and it gets a 6 total. Delve also gets 2s all across, very popular league. Player agency, so Delve, you go down into a mine and there's infinitely expanding branching paths that you get to choose which direction you go and which nodes you pick, so you get to choose your path entirely yourself, so there's a lot of choice there. Combat burst, 2, most of these encounters in the Delve have tons of mobs spawning or very difficult bosses down in there. And rewards are 2. Delve is very rewarding in a lot of different ways. This also goes back to player agency. There's also parts of the mine where you have to go into basically the shadows or the darkness that damages you, but there can be rewards off in those side areas. Of course, you don't have to go do that. You can stay in the lighted areas where you're safe from the damage of the darkness. So that's another choice you can make, but there was lots of different rewards and very good rewards at that in Delve. So it gets a 6. Betrayal, player agency 2. There was a lot of choices you had to make in deciding where your syndicate members, that's what they're fucking called. I forgot what they were called. Where your syndicate members would go inside of the syndicate, which determined their rewards, and you could also upgrade or downgrade them so they're more or less difficult. Combat burst, I gave a 1 because on release, while the fighting is intense, there was a lot of one-shots and it caused the game to lag a lot. So it's mostly fixed now. Now it could maybe be a 2, but we'll give it a 1 because it definitely had some issues. The fighting was intense, but it was probably too intense because when you just get one shot and there's no visual clarity, it's not that fun of increased combat. And then the rewards, I give a 2. Betrayal has some very, very good rewards in the Syndicate hideouts. So it gets a 5. Synthesis. Player agency, a 2. So basically for Synthesis, you went into a smaller encounter. You completed it by going and clicking on little pedestals in certain corners of this small area to complete the synthesized area. Then you would have that in your collection, and you could use these little map areas you've collected and sort of spread them out on tiles and traverse these tiles to go to different reward zones. A little confusing, but there was a lot of choice. Combat burst, 1. These areas did have, they had monsters in them. I wouldn't say a lot, and some of them were a little overpowered on release. And I don't think the bosses were that great, but I'd give it a 1 because it wasn't non-existent, but it wasn't the best. Rewards, give it a 1. The crafting system was convoluted at best. I personally didn't mind the crafting system, but a lot of people didn't like it. And the other way you got rewards from traversing those tiles and going to the reward spots, at first they weren't that good either. That ended up getting buffed later. But we'll just give it a 1. There was not the best, not the worst rewards. So Synthesis gets a 4. Legion. Legion gets 2s across the board. Player agency. This is where you got to pick which monsters to break open and actually fight. And then combat burst. If you broke open all the monsters, there was some intense fighting, and the end game encounters, there was lots of stuff to kill. And rewards were pretty good, especially for the end game room. If you had a really good character, you could get a shit ton of loot. Yeah, maybe it was overtuned on release, but now it's definitely probably at a 2. It's very rewarding and probably not overly rewarding now. So it gets a 6. Blight. Player agency, get a 2. This is mostly because you get the crafting system was anointments on your rings, and then this was the tower defense, or anointments on rings and amulets. That gave a lot of choice, as well as this was with the Tower Defense League, so you got to choose which towers you wanted to build or to not build towers, stuff like that. So there was a lot of choice. The combat burst gets a 1. The mobs spawn kind of slowly, and it didn't exactly feel like the tower defense mode that people wanted it to feel like. And then the reward is a 2 because not the per instance rewards or the per map where there's a blight encounter in every map, but the actual blighted maps give a lot of loot. Very rewarding. So it gets a 5. Metamorph. Player agency. This is where you build your own bosses by putting organs together. There was a lot of choices in how you wanted to build your boss, how difficult it could be, how rewarding it could be. Combat burst, I gave it a 1. I had a hard time actually being able to see what the hell the bosses actually did. So it was either I face tanked it and just sat there and spammed my skill on it and it died, or it killed me. For some ranged based characters, it'd probably be easier to actually interact with, but it was very visually cluttered and hard to tell what the fuck's going on. But I'll give it a 1 because there was definitely increased combat intensity. Rewards, I give it a 1. This could maybe be a 2. I did end up getting quite a few exalts from Metamorph encounters, but that was, for the most part, the most valuable thing I got from it. Most of the time it didn't feel that great, but getting the exalts definitely did feel good. So yeah, gets a 1. Maybe it could be a 2. It gets a 4. So those were all the Path of Exile leagues I know a decent amount about, that I've played in, or I just know about from them being added into the base game. Now here's the Diablo 3 seasons. Season 14 was Season of Greed, where loot goblins were doubled, and this one's going to score the highest out of all of them. So, player agency. You could choose to go and farm goblins, or you could choose to not go and farm goblins, because they don't spawn in greater rifts. So you could choose to farm them or choose not to farm them, and since most people don't... farming goblins isn't part of the meta of Diablo 3 endgame, there was a choice to be made there whether or not to go and farm them. Combat burst, we give a 1, and this is the only seasonal theme that's gonna get above a 0 here, and that's solely because of goblin packs would basically spawn twice as big, and there was twice as much stuff to kill and chase around and get loot from. And reward gets a 1. Certain goblins do give pretty decent rewards, and having that doubled was, it was doubled. It wasn't amazing. I don't think most people went out of their way to go and farm goblins, so it wasn't hugely rewarding, but it definitely did give twice as much. So with that, one scores a 3 on our 3 key elements. Season 15, Haradrim. Double bounty caches. Player agency. You could choose whether or not to farm more bounties, because it gave you double. So it gets a 1 for choosing whether or not you want to farm more bounties than you normally would. Combat burst. This did not change combat in any way. Reward. 1, you get double bounties. Season 16, Grandeur. This is where you got the effective Royal Ring of Grandeur for free. So here we give player agency a 1, and I said earlier on, I was being lenient so that all the Diablo 3s didn't get all 0s, because your choice here is to put on what 1 extra ring you want. And the other choices here where we've had so far are, do you do this mechanic or do you skip this mechanic? So having to decide whether or not to engage with the mechanic at all basically gave it a 1. Grandeur, you pick your extra ring. There was no increased combat, and there was no increased reward. Season 17, Legacy of Nightmares. You got the Legacy of Nightmares buff for free. Player agency, you got a 1. So you choose whether or not you want a Legacy of Nightmares build, and if you do, then you get a choice of 2 extra rings that you normally wouldn't get. No increased combat. No increased or better rewards. Season 18, Triune. This one is gonna get a 0 in everything. No player agency. This buff was always on you. You couldn't choose whether or not to interact with it. This was where circles spawned on the ground when you hit monsters, and they gave one of 3 buffs. The only choices that were being made were positional choices, and the effect was always on. You didn't choose whether or not to engage with the seasonal theme. It always affected you. Maybe an argument that you would choose to go and stand in these circles, but there wasn't much of a choice. If it was a safe spot to stand, you would try to go stand in it. If not, you don't stand in it. There's not much of a choice to be made there. So we'll say there was no choice. You either stood it. If it was safe to stand in, you chose to stand in it, and if it wasn't, you didn't. There's not a choice to really be made there besides, is this a safe spot to stand? No increased combat. It did sort of change how you positioned and fought, but it didn't make combat much, didn't really change the intensity of combat. It didn't give increased rewards. So that one scores a 0. Season 19, Conflict. What the hell was that one? Kill streak buff. Oh yeah, that's the one we just had. Okay. Player agency, and it's only getting a point here because you could choose whether or not to reset the buff. And yeah, maybe you could somehow choose to skip certain mobs to save the buff a certain breakpoint for later on. So there was some choices being made. Combat intensity didn't really increase. It didn't exactly give you more things to kill, so it kind of worked backwards from how we want combat burst to work, which is to give you more things to fight or more powerful things to fight. And this just killed things quicker, so that's kind of cool, but it doesn't really increase the intensity of combat. There was no extra rewards tied to this. And season 20, which hasn't come out yet, but we know what's gonna happen. You get to choose anything in your cube slots, even if it doesn't match the ring, weapon, or armor slot. You can put anything into any of those 3 spots. So there are some extra choices to be made in the cube, but it's not hugely impactful. There's not a lot of choices to be made, so it gets a 1. Combat burst, 0. It's not gonna make more mobs or more difficult mobs, stuff like that. Reward is 0. There's not extra rewards, so it gets a 1. Now that we've gone through each of those, we can look back at my Path of Exile, the scores I gave for the Path of Exile leagues, and how I thought the community received them. And we can see that my scoring doesn't exactly match up with my impressions of how the community in general responded to each league. There are some other factors that we didn't account for in the scoring system, such as the theme of the league. This impacted the perception of Blight and Bestiary heavily. Blight was the tower defense league. A lot of people were either very excited or very turned off by the fact that it was a tower defense based mechanic. And then Bestiary, this was basically kind of like your Pokemon collect 'em all sort of thing. A lot of people were very excited about that type of league. I didn't give a shit at all. So the theme of the league can impact how the community viewed it. How confusing or straightforward the league mechanic is can also affect the perception of it. So this heavily affected Synthesis and somewhat affected Betrayal. Synthesis, the crafting system, it was basically hidden, and it was kind of complicated to figure out. Also, the placing of pieces in the Synthesis area didn't make a whole lot of sense. It's a rather confusing process. Once you figured it out, it's not that hard, but there was definitely like an unnecessary barrier to entry into figuring out how the fuck that league worked. Betrayal, the confusing part was mostly what syndicate members give what rewards. The reward system is complicated to say the least. Even I have trouble with it still. I literally write down exactly where I need each person to be. Not very straightforward. That can cause some negative perception there. How confusing or straightforward a league is. So that negatively affected Synthesis and Betrayal to some extent. It also, I would say, positively affected Legion, Breach, Abyss, Metamorph, Delve. These are all very straightforward leagues. It's very easy to figure out what to do, and people like it when it's easy to figure out. It doesn't have to be super simple, but have been seeing a positive trend with the more simple league mechanics. Not to saying that having it be somewhat complicated is bad, but trending towards a little bit simpler seem to be better. And another thing that could influence perception of a league is major bugs or balancing problems at launch. This heavily affected Synthesis, Betrayal, Bestiary, all had pretty bad balancing or bugs. Especially Betrayal had a lot of lag and bugs associated with it. So those are definitely some other factors that can account for how the community perceived these leagues. But when we look at the three elements that make a fun or successful league that I'd laid out, there's one element that nearly every league that received mostly or overwhelmingly positive feedback all scored 2s on, and that is the bursts of increased fighting or combat intensity. So if we look at Synthesis, I gave the combat intensity a 1. Everything in the mixed column got a 1, and everything in the positive column got a 2 except for Metamorph. And that could maybe be a 2. I didn't like it too much, but all these other ones are definitely 2s in the increased combat intensity. Having more monsters or harder monsters to kill is something that I think all players in both games always want, and that is probably the most important element to include in every league or season to have a fun league or season. And notably, this is the one category that every single Diablo 3 season has missed, except kind of the Goblin one. But that's really a stretch. I'm being very generous. Looking at the scores given to the Diablo 3 seasons, I felt like I was being very generous with the scores I gave, and even then it's mostly 1s or 0s in the total column, and which pretty accurately reflects my sentiment that every single league so far has been extremely every single season and all themes so far has been extremely underwhelming and not game-changing enough to make me want to play a season extensively, because at the end of the day it feels like the exact same as the previous 19 seasons. I still like the game, and I did like playing seasons at one point, but after you play seasons for so long, some people get tired of them if they're the same thing every season, when the only thing changing is what the best build is of the 3 or 4 class builds that you have available. The seasonal theme isn't having a huge impact, so it basically feels the same every single season. So the seasonal theme isn't having the intended effect of making a season feel special. It feels like a very small gimmick at best. With these criteria in mind, for a seasonal theme, I've come up with 2 ideas for Diablo 3 seasonal themes that I think could realistically be put into the game given the size and scope of recent patches. So even though the Diablo 3 team is smaller and putting out smaller patches, I still think that these 2 ideas could realistically be implemented with the current systems that are in the game with some very slight alterations. So first idea is Season of Cursed Ancients. What is this? Once per rift, you'll come across one of 3 types of an ancient cursed chest. These cursed chests are very powerful, enhanced versions of a normal cursed chest. The 3 different types of cursed chests determine what enemies will spawn from the cursed chest. An ancient horde cursed chest will rapidly spawn hundreds of normal mobs over a short period of time. So just gonna be stuff flooding the screen for, I don't know, 10 to 20 seconds. Or a little bit longer. However long feels right when you're, testing this. And the next type of cursed chest, an ancient elite cursed chest, will spawn 10 to 15 yellow and or blue packs at the same time. And an ancient guardian chest will spawn 3 bosses / rift guardians at once. Once successfully completed, if you're under level 70 when you do this mechanic, you'll be guaranteed 1 legendary from the cursed chest. If your character is level 70, they'll be guaranteed 1 ancient legendary, 1 random ancient legendary. And while playing on Torment 1 or higher, the guaranteed ancient legendary has 10% chance to be primal. So, things to consider when trying to balance this seasonal mechanic so that the reward is not too strong. Possibly have the event be timed so that it can fail, and or also have it fail if you die during the Ancient Cursed Chest event. Possibly have the Ancient Legendary be the only drop from the chest, because I'm pretty sure, from what I've seen, getting primals is still very hard to do. Have the Ancient Legendary be the only thing that comes out of the chest, because a 10% chance for it to be primal per chest should be a valuable enough reward on its own. I believe I remember people getting like less than 100 primals in a season. So having a chance for every basically getting 1 primal, 1 in every 10 chests, should be a shit ton of primals. Maybe you balance that percentage differently or whatever. But yeah, you get the idea. Maybe it's too overpowered and needs to be toned back, but you want this to be something that players want to actually engage with, so the reward should be valuable to them. Other things to consider would be the placement of the chest in the rift. Should it be able to spawn on any floor in the rift? Should it always spawn on the first floor? Should it only spawn after a certain percentage of the rift is complete? I think these all have valid options. Allowing it to spawn anywhere would make it so players have to go and search for it, if it's rewarding enough. If you have it always spawn on the first floor, this could make a new meta of finding the chest in a rift and then restarting the rift. Now, this kind of goes against some of their game design of wanting to complete the rifts, but it does implement another layer, right, of what people are doing, another strategy. So the current strategies or the current things to do are bounties, rifts, greater rifts. And rifts, greater rifts are going to be the most rewarding for your time, and rifts have to be done to open greater rifts, and greater rifts give the most rewards in the game. Basically the best bang for your buck is from greater rifts. So giving players another strategy to farm gear I don't think is a bad thing, even if it means that they have to reset the rifts, which is kind of feels bad that they're not finishing them the natural way, but I think involving another strategy to farm gear wouldn't be a bad idea. One problem with spawning chests that you would want to keep in mind when designing this is where it spawns on one map or on one level rifts where there's only one floor. If the spawn is determined by what percentage you complete or after killing the Rift Guardian, it needs somewhere to be spawned. You just need to know where it's going to spawn, and if it's going to spawn backwards in the rift, you don't want that. So whichever way you implement this, you need to make sure that the chest spawns somewhere in front of the player, because going backwards through nothingness to try and find this chest would feel really shitty. You definitely want to keep the placement of where the chest is going to be in the rifts in mind when you're designing this league mechanic. Another way we could implement cursed ancient chests would be with bounties as well, along with the things spawning in rifts, to incentivize players to still do bounties. Have, of all the bounties in a given instance or in your game, so through X 1 through 5, include all those bounties. One of them on completion will spawn an ancient cursed chest. So it could be the first one you do, or it could be the last one you do, but there's going to be one that spawns after completing a bounty. So that could also be a thing. A negative to consider for this seasonal theme is that it would speed up an already too fast gear progression system. So balancing the reward there would be something to keep in mind. But you want the reward to still be valuable, so that's definitely a very difficult point to this seasonal theme. That is one flaw of this seasonal theme, is trying to find a good balance between not speeding up the gear progression too much, but making it so that it's still worthwhile to interact with the seasonal theme. Now let's go over those 3 criteria again. I believe if implemented correctly, it would score at least a 1 in player agency. So you choose based on the type of chest you see, whether or not to open it, because maybe you're good at clearing lots of mobs, but you're really bad at clearing bosses, so you don't open the boss ones. A 2 in burst combat, if done correctly, there should be a huge increase in combat intensity. And a 2 in reward, if done correctly, the reward would be worth going for. Also, another thing for player agency that could increase it is, depending on the spawning mechanism chosen, whether it always spawns on the first floor, or spawns after a certain percentage, or spawns after the Rift Guardian, players can decide whether it's worth trying to go and find it or not, or whether it's worth restarting the rift. That's another choice they could be making, depending on the mechanic chosen in spawning the chests. And bam. Fast forward 2 weeks, so the new Path of Exile League dropped, and the new TFT set dropped. So this video got put on hold for a little bit, and I didn't expect it to be this long. I've already edited the previous 45 minutes. So, that's the scenery change and whatever. Let's move on to the last 2 ideas I have for seasonal themes. So, Season of Pandemonium. So for this seasonal theme, you would collect 3 keys to open a Pandemonium Rift. And there are 3 different key types, and you need 1 of each type to open the rift. You get the different key types from bounties, rifts, and greater rifts, so you have to do all 3 to get the 3 different types. So one type would only drop from bounties, the other only from rifts, and the third only from greater rifts. The key types, there would be one that modifies the difficulty of the rift, one that changes the mob type in the rift, and one that changes the layout of the rift. And every key has a random reward type on it. So some example mods for the key types. Difficulty mods, you could have stuff that reduces resource or HP regen. All mobs have frenzy, reduced player speed. All mobs have molten. Things that would just make it more difficult. Anything that could make it more difficult throughout the entire rift. Mob mods. This is basically you select what type of mobs you want to spawn in the rift. So could be tons of different variations of this. You could do like only cow or only goatmen, only giants, so you get like all the big mobs like mallet lords, executioners, exorcists, chargers, etc. You could have it be the entire rift is only rares, the entire rift is only rift guardians, only loot goblins, all mobs drop gold, all mobs drop blood shards, so these would be like normal mobs, but they all drop that specific thing. And this would be the Pandemonium Rift would be played on the Torment difficulty that you're on, and loot would drop normally unless modified like a normal rift, but with these modifiers in place. And then layout mods, you could have one that is just one long hallway, so something that's really good for small AoE builds like Whirlwind. One huge open room, stuff that would be good for like Unhallowed Essence Demon Hunter. And then you can have some layouts that are like all sand tiles, all woods outdoors tiles, all hell themed tiles. And then you can sort of figure out based on the different themes which tiles within those themes are ones that you like. So once you complete the rift, you would get the reward. So each key has one reward type on it, and at the end of the Pandemonium Rift, a random reward is chosen from each reward type that was on the keys you used, and you pick one of the 3 rewards. So let me go over the reward types, and then I'll give a more specific example if that didn't make sense. So a temporary buff, buff lasts X amount of time, and whenever I use X here, that's going to be a constant, but I put it as X because I don't want to pick a specific number, just have that number be whatever would be decided on is balanced. So X will always be the same, it's just I don't have a specific balanced number in mind. So buff lasts X amount of time and provides increased of one of the following: XP gain, damage, CDR, RCR, attack speed, resource, regen, etc., stuff like that. And one note here to keep this somewhat balanced, you would probably, if you got this buff and it lasted long enough for you to grab another reward buff, it'd probably have to replace the old reward buff. Otherwise, you may end up in a scenario where people try to push greater rifts by stacking like 5-10 of the damage buff or CDR buff and do ridiculous things like that. So you might want to have that buff be unique, where only one of them can be active at a time. Anyways, okay, so next reward type, Uber item. It gives you a random Hellfire Amulet or X of Uber mats or Uber devices. So just a random Hellfire Amulet or a random stack of materials or devices. Normal mats, X of normal blue or yellow crafting mats. Go along with that, cube mats. It gives you a stack of a random type of cube materials. Miscellaneous stack items, it randomly gives you a stack of Greater Rift keys, gold, blood shards, or gems. Next, upgraded gem gives you a random level X legendary gem. Next, ancient item for a specific slot. So there would be a reward type for every single slot. So you would have the reward type on the key would say get a one random ancient helm or random weapon, random chest piece, whatever. It would have one for every slot. And then the last reward type is change an item, so it would randomly be upgrade a rare, reforge a legendary, convert set item, socket a weapon, convert gem type, convert crafting mats, remove level requirements. So most of those change item things are coming out of Kanai's cube. And then also the socket weapon. How would this work? Let's say you put in your 3 keys and they had Uber item reward, an ancient item or an ancient weapon, and an upgraded gem. So at the end of the rift, after you kill the Rift Guardian, it would randomly pick out of the Uber item options, one of those options, and then it would pick random, what did I say, gem? So it would pick a random legendary gem with that's already pre-leveled to a certain point, and then third, it would pick a random ancient weapon. And then you would see those 3 options and you would pick one of the 3, whichever 3 that you want. And then the other 2 are discarded or whatever. You only get one of the 3 rewards. So this seasonal theme is probably a little bit bigger in scope, might be out of scope for patch in Diablo 3 now, but it doesn't really introduce any hugely new mechanics. It just builds off of stuff already in the game and combines them in new ways, essentially. So that's why I think it would be feasible, but there would still be quite a bit of work to be done here, I believe. But it would still be interesting, and you don't have to add, not a whole lot of new stuff needs to be added, it's just repurposing of a lot of things that already exist. Then if we go and think about our 3 different criteria for seasonal themes, player choice. So there would be a ton of player choice. You would pick your keys depending on what kind of mods you like, and also you'd have to balance that between the reward types that rolled on those mods. So maybe you'd run mods that you don't like for better reward types that you like more, or maybe you'd run the mods that you like and you don't care about the reward type at all. And then once the rewards are seen at the end, you get to pick between the 3, whichever one you like best. So there would be quite a bit of choice there. Combat burst, that is mostly coming from the difficulty mods key. Also partially the mob mods, and maybe the layout could increase or change the intensity of combat there. So that'd probably be at least a 1. The player choice probably a 2. And our last one, the rewards, as long as the rewards were balanced in a way where people want to farm for them, then it would be a 2. So those were both of the seasonal theme ideas I had originally, and it's been 2 weeks since I started making the video. I sort of came up with a third one, very out of scope idea, but the quick overview, I'm not going to have a whole graphic for it or anything, but quick idea is it'd be a season where you can combine 2 legendary items into 1, whether or not they can be from different types of pieces of gear, like combining chest pieces with weapons. That probably wouldn't be ideal because you'd end up combining probably 1 skilled stat onto all your pieces. So let's just say you combine two legendaries into 1 of the same item slot. So you can combine two weapons, a Yang's Recurve and what's it called? A Dawn. Combine Yang's Recurve and Dawn into 1 item, and to make this balanced, you wouldn't just slam 2 legendaries together. It would have to have a huge cost investment. So let's just for randomly thrown at the idea where you literally have to put in basically every type of crafting material in the game to do this. So you have to do cube mats, normal mats, rift keys, gems, uber mats, all these different kinds of mats. You have to put them all together to combine two ancient legendaries, let's say. They have to be ancient. You have to use all these crafting mats, and then you can combine these two legendaries, and the result is, I don't know how you want to do the stats, but whatever weapon you get at the end is going to have both legendary affixes, or whatever piece of gear is going to have both legendary affixes on it, and then it's going to randomly reroll the stats, let's say, and it could be normal, legendary, ancient, or primal, and that would have the same drop rate, or the same outcome as normal drop rates, so 10% on ancients and then 10% on primals. I believe that's how those numbers work. And the fact that you would have to combine two ancient pieces and tons of materials to do this, it would sort of make it a long-term thing to do throughout the entire season, where you have to build up all these mats, find the right legendaries, then combine them, and then hope that they roll ancient or hope that they roll primal. So this is something you could do throughout the entire season, and you could be experimenting with different pieces of gear, because unlike the cube where you can easily swap out each piece, with the cost investment here, crafting each piece would be sort of an experiment, where it's like, if you combine these two chess pieces and you end up not liking the results, if you wanted to make a different chess piece, well, you'd have to go through that process again, where it's like, maybe I want to use this third chess piece instead to make this item or whatever. So I think that could be a pretty neat idea. Probably very, very far out of scope and would never happen, but it's something I thought of and I thought I would share. So I think that's all I wanted to hit on for the balance and seasonal themes idea. Quick recap of everything. GR150 cap is good. Make Paragon less impactful in some way. Be more ambitious with your seasonal themes, and try to hit those 3 criteria maybe that will hopefully result in better seasonal themes: combat burst, player choice, and rewards. Yeah, I think that wraps it up. Thank you all for watching. Let me know your thoughts on Diablo 3 balance and seasonal themes and anything I mentioned. Yeah, I'd be interested to see your guys' ideas as well. Hope you all have a good rest of your day or night. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.